Welcome to another episode of Bitcoin Magazine Live. I'm your host, Q, coming to you yet again from my mother's basement. And today is Monday, September 19th, and we have a special Bitcoin Magazine Live in store for you all today. This is going to be exclusively covering the Craig Wright Hodlonaut trial. We're going to kick things off in just a moment with our recap of day 6 of the trial, and we will, of course, be joined by our reporter on the ground, Mills, and a couple of special guests. Chris, if we can roll the tape and we'll get things started just right now.
It was the sixth day of the Hodlonaut versus Craig Wright trial here in Oslo. The first part of the day were the remaining 3 witnesses called by Craig Wright's team. The first 2 were from BDO. They pointed out a few technical discrepancies, but the judge asked a clarifying question at the end, taking all of this into account. Would this have actually affected any of the content? To which they said no. The last witness was a cyber and corporate investigator at Sci4. She clarified that her analysis is a high-level review due to time constraints rather than a merely critical report. After completing all of the witness testimonies and expert witnesses, Hawkes began his closing statement. He reviewed points Craig Wright made during his witness testimony, points made in the KPMG report, reviewed the signing session with Andreessen. He basically did a high-level review of all the points previously made and drew a connection between all of the arguments. Hawkes' last remarks were very powerful. He was summarizing the legal system in Norway, citing the freedom of speech outlined by the Norwegian Constitution and the European Convention of Human Rights. You need to have the possibility to criticize people in power. It protects the individual's right to search for the truth. This case is about 9 separate tweets over 4 days in March of 2019. What is the defamatory element in the tweets? Which statements damage the reputation of Craig Wright? A defamatory statement that is true is lawful. A true statement is always protected. That's it for today. We will be back on Wednesday for the last day of this 7-day trial here in Oslo.
And I'm now excited to introduce our reporter on the ground, Mills. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So before I bring on our special guests, I wanted to give you the opportunity to comment on anything from day 6 that stood out to you. We just heard some of those comments from Hodlonaut's lawyers' closing remarks, the passionate plea for just humanity and decency. Anything in particular you wanted to touch on?
Well, the day ended up starting in a very surprising manner with the legal team of Hodlonaut asking for a couple additional pieces of evidence to be admitted and also another witness to be called. So the beginning of the day was that discussion, which was strongly opposed by by Craig Wright's legal team. And the judge ended up kind of saying, we will allow the holes, as she called them, the 2 tweets that were brought up in day 2 in the Craig Wright opening remarks, that there weren't any screenshots of the tweets that were referenced, and that was a Peter Todd tweet and response, both from Peter Todd and then from Craig Wright. And so that was admitted. But then as to the additional witness, which we get to have this exclusive privilege, but Dustin Trammell was also cited as, willing to go on the stand and that he had discussed with Hodlonaut's lawyers. The judge said that hadn't been a major component in her notes that she had taken from Craig Wright's statement on day 2. So that was declined. And then kind of setting the stage here, then this morning, Dustin posted his own statement online that anyone can go read of just where Craig was saying things that Dustin wanted to refute, but we can let him talk about that. But the day opened, before we got to the final 3 witnesses, the day opened with this kind of unplanned, recap after the weekend of all of the things and trying to add this last minute evidence in.
And on that note, I'm excited to introduce our special guests for today, Dustin Trammell, which Mills you have now cited, as well as Matt Odell. Thank you both for joining us. Dustin, your name has been brought up, whether you liked it or not, multiple times now in this case. Would love to give you the opportunity now to comment on that. First, just what was going through your mind as you heard your name being discussed, and give you the opportunity to just sort of refute anything that was said as well.
Sure. First of all, it's Trammell, so it's slightly different pronunciation. But the statements that Craig made on the stand during his testimony regarding sending early copies of the white paper and/or the code to various people. He mentioned me as one of the recipients of early version of the code. I was involved in Bitcoin from the very beginning, but I didn't actually have any contact with the real Satoshi for a few days after the public release of the code. Satoshi at no time ever sent me any early copies of anything. I found out about Bitcoin as the rest of the world did when the white paper was published, and then the first copy of the code I downloaded myself from the website after it was publicly released. So to hear that claim come from Craig on the stand under oath was quite surprising to me. I reached out to Hodlonaut's legal team offering the information, and they tried to get me in this morning, but because this was in direct response to Craig's testimony, they of course had no idea what he was going to say on the stand before the trial, and so could not possibly have known they needed to submit me as a witness prior to the trial beginning. So because they hadn't submitted me prior to, the judge declined to include it. And so I released my own statement today just to kind of set the record straight on my involvement with the beginning of Bitcoin and my involvement with speaking directly to Satoshi and what I may or may not have received.
And we're going to post a link, Dustin, to that statement that you released. I believe it was on your blog.
That's
but
correct.
do you mind for any of our audience who didn't have yet a chance to go over it, touching on a few of those points that you shared?
Sure. So in Craig's testimony, while he was on the stand, he listed off a number of people that he supposedly sent early copies of the code to. He mentioned Hal Finney, a couple of other people, and then at the end, he said, and a bit later, Dustin Trammell. So I was responding directly to that statement to kind of outline when I got the first copy of the code that, like I said, I downloaded myself from the website.
And we're about to post that over in the YouTube and Rumble chats as well. Odell, I wanted to get your thoughts. This trial is now, it's about to wrap up. We have one more day left. It's been a long journey to get here, the preparation leading up to it. How are you feeling? How is the, I guess, overall environment around what's been discussed and some of the statements coming out of the trial and all?
Well, I mean, first of all, thanks for having me. I just wanted to thank you and Mills for the fantastic coverage and her team that's over there. It's been extremely helpful for those of us following the coverage from afar and following the trial from afar. To me, the biggest thing here is that there is actually coverage of this trial. Like a lot of these trials that Craig has been doing behind the scenes are barely not covered. And when they are covered, they're covered by people that are strictly in his camp and on his side. So to actually see solid, impartial coverage that includes video inside the courtroom, I think has opened up a lot of people's eyes that might not have been opened otherwise.
Absolutely. I think this trial would have slipped through the cracks. I take no credit whatsoever. This is all Mills and the boots on the ground. So thank you for that as well. Ladies, gentlemen, this trial has been one of the largest stories on all of Bitcoin Twitter, as we've seen people coming out of the woodworks, people getting thrown, just names getting thrown out into a courtroom that no one was expecting to hear. For the two of you who've been watching this case from afar, as I have has anything stood out to you guys where, whether it be on the technical side or whether it just be on certain timelines that Craig and his team are introducing, is there any one thing in particular where, as people who have been in Bitcoin for as long as the two of you have, do you feel as though, oh, he is taking advantage of people who don't know Bitcoin as well? If they knew Bitcoin a little bit more, if they knew it as much as I do, they would be able to call him out right then and there. Has there been anything like that? And if so, what were those things?
Well, so I mean, Dustin has, obviously been in Bitcoin for longer than pretty much anyone. Satoshi hasn't beat, but to me as a bystander, when all the Craig claims came out originally, has always been around, my belief has always been around signing a message with the keys. And the reason is because before Bitcoin was created, there was no way to trustlessly verify ownership of wealth throughout the world. Bitcoin made that possible. You have private keys and you were able to sign a message without giving up access to those keys, without giving up access to your funds that is cryptographically verifiable by anyone in the world. And Craig has always been reluctant to do that. Now, it's important to realize that simply signing a message from early keys does not necessarily prove you are Satoshi, because we don't know if Satoshi controlled those keys once. We don't know if they've been stolen, whatnot. But if you're going to make a claim about ownership of this protocol and creation of this protocol, then at the very least, you should have a signed message from early keys. And Craig was always reluctant to do that. He did the backroom thing with Gavin. Who even knows what happened there? There was never any cryptographic message signed. And I think, so when I was looking at his claims in the early days, as the weeks went on and he refused to do that, to me, that made his claim bogus. And I think the fact that this was highlighted in the courtroom, the fact that it was on video of him essentially saying, the judge asking him, why do you go through this whole process without signing a message? His answer was extremely lackluster. It was just straight up excuses. And I think to actually have that on the record, have him, dodging that question is going to be extremely powerful going forward.
Yeah, to add to that point, with the issue around the Bitcoin private keys not really proving identity, just proving ownership or control of particular addresses. We do know a handful of blocks that we're fairly certain that Satoshi controlled. First, the Genesis block, obviously. It was manually created to bootstrap the entire blockchain by Satoshi. There were 2 blocks where Satoshi sent Bitcoin to Hal Finney and to myself. I'm fairly certain that Satoshi controlled those 2 blocks. And then, to a lesser extent, the 1.1 million, Bitcoin worth of blocks that Satoshi presumably mined. That said, there are other keys which do include an identity component. Satoshi had a very well-known PGP private and public key pair with the Satoshi email address identity tied to it. It was published on the bitcoin.org website for a long while. And it has an extensive web of trust attached to it, which is where other people can sign someone's key, their public key, to essentially vouch for it and say, I've either verified that this identity that's tied to this key is correct, or I strongly believe it's correct. The PGP actually has a range of values there where you can express how confident you are that the identity is correct for that key. Craig Wright has never signed a message with Satoshi's PGP key either. So, while Bitcoin public and private key pairs may not include an identity component, PGP keys certainly do. So that would be another option for someone purporting to be Satoshi to be able to sign a message using a key that is well known to be Satoshi's key.
And yet he continues to refuse, and there seems to be no movement on whether or not he will do that. There were a lot of statements regarding this exact sort of thought process, both questions from the judge as well as during Craig Wright's testimony, where Craig even alluded to saying, well, this is all over if I do that, and I want the courts themselves to sort of force this to happen. Dustin, you're laughing. The day this
of course
news
it
came
would be
out,
over, because the vast majority of people would be convinced. So of course it would be over.
but does that really, is that feasible? Would it actually be possible for a court order to dictate and say, hey, the court says these coins need to be moved based on the findings or the rulings of this case? We had Ben Price come on, join us on that day, and I felt at least like there were a lot more questions about, is Craig Wright actually being serious, or is he just conflating certain things to make it sound like, hey, if you do this, like it's possible, when in reality that may not actually be as feasible as he's leading the courts to believe.
But he also was very adamant that he will never, that he has no desire, and that his movement is to amass this 100 character witnesses. And there's a little conjecture if that's exactly the reason why he dismissed his previous legal team in Norway. But I think there was some tension of him wanting more witnesses and then wanting to lean more on the documentary evidence, and there being a misalignment there. So it doesn't seem as if, and from what he said directly to the judge, that he will not sign, that this is not, he does not want to, he will not, it is not the way that he wants to proceed.
Ultimately, it seems as though a lot of decisions, a lot of things, there are a lot of things this judge needs to consider before making her determination. Dustin, obviously we have your blog post, and hopefully this judge will actually take the time to read it. But if there was any one specific point for the judge to take away from what your testimony would have been on the stand, what would that be?
Essentially that, Craig blatantly lied under oath on the stand. If the goal of Hodlonaut's team is to show that his statements online were truthful and not slander, libel, or defamatory, you need to show that Craig is a liar and Craig is a fraud. I think the mountain of evidence that Craig submitted that was picked apart by KPMG shows that he's creating fraudulent evidence. That makes him a fraud. And he lied on the stand. That makes him a liar. So that hits your 2 points right there. I think from the evidentiary standpoint, the most damning of the evidence submitted, at least in my opinion, is the executable Bitcoin client file. The Windows executables contain a checksum that is created when they're built from source code. And unmodified, that checksum will check out. If that binary has been modified in any way without being recompiled from source with those modifications, the checksum is no longer going to match. That really has nothing to do with Bitcoin private keys or signatures or anything. There's really no other way that can happen other than someone intentionally modifying the binary executable in some way. So that, I think, was probably the strongest piece of evidence to show that this version of the Bitcoin application was backdated by manually changing bytes in the binary executable file, which caused the checksum to no longer match up. Craig frequently gets caught by checksums. he tends to miss those when he's modifying is evidence.
Like, I know that this is not legal precedent, but couldn't we just, I don't know, lock Craig in a room and ask him to just recreate the code that he says he created 13 years ago? This seems like a very simple thing. I have a stupid question, but I am the youngest Bitcoiner in this quadrant that we find ourselves in. And I want to ask this question genuinely. Regardless if Craig is found to be Satoshi or not in the court of the law, does that matter for the broader Bitcoin ecosystem in any of your opinions? Ultimately, we've seen nation states ban Bitcoin. We've seen states in this country limit or inhibit the ability to mine Bitcoin and even prevent certain exchanges from allowing the state citizens from even purchasing Bitcoin. So ultimately, if this court in Oslo determines actually, yes, Hodlonaut defamed and Craig Wright is Satoshi in some roundabout way, does that matter in the grand scheme of things? Yes, I did just ask that question.
Can I start because I'm like the youngest after you in the Bitcoin space? I would say not anymore. Maybe if it was 2017, maybe yes, but I don't see it, and that's my vantage point personally. I don't see it making a huge difference.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I don't think it really matters all that much anymore. The biggest risk, I think, to Bitcoin would be if Craig was somehow able to actually move the coins and liquidate them, and cause a price shock or something like that in the market, which of course Bitcoin would recover from anyway. It would be a short-term effect. And if a court were to rule that Craig is Satoshi and try to enforce some kind of reassignment of the coins through the blockchain, they would have to somehow enforce that. Bitcoin is a global network. The jurisdiction where that would be attempted to be enforced would be a small part of the network overall. And it would probably cause a contentious fork, in which case some people are going to go with the fork. Some people are going to go stick with the original Bitcoin where the coins haven't moved. And the market will decide which of those two is the better option. I feel the vast majority of Bitcoiners would probably go with the fork where coins don't move.
The whole point of Bitcoin is that nobody controls it. Satoshi does not control it. So regardless of if this court case, how it results, regardless if the actual Satoshi comes out tomorrow and says I'm Satoshi and I'm gonna sell my coin, it doesn't matter. That person or group of individuals does not control Bitcoin. Nobody does. Now, the part where this case is relevant is that if someone's going around with lots of money and bogus claims and attacking Bitcoin contributors behind closed doors, that becomes a problem. And that becomes a chilling effect on all Bitcoin contributors and all Bitcoin development. And that is what we've been seeing in practice. And, that's why this court case is ultimately important. And I would just to add on to Dustin's thought processes there in terms of a fork situation, I think it's important for the audience to realize that anyone can fork Bitcoin at any time. I could go and fork Bitcoin right now, and my fork could take all of Satoshi's coins and they could be my coins. But ultimately, every stakeholder in Bitcoin, every user of Bitcoin would need to update their node to go along with my fork. And beyond, there's no way anyone go along with that with me. It is an important aspect to realize that literally anyone can fork Bitcoin, no permission required. And then ultimately it's up to users to decide which rule set they want to follow.
So eloquently put. I don't think I could do anything better other than just say TikTok next block. Mills, we spent a lot of time talking about Craig Wright. I want to unpack though the witness today that was highlighted in the recap video. She specifically, you mentioned that the report that she put together was done more for the sake of simplicity and was not as detailed as it could have been. Was there anything impactful in that report that she shared, and what specifically were her findings?
Yeah, she cited maybe 4 or 5 times that due to time constraints, I'm not sure at what point she was brought on to do this report, but when Hodlonaut's lawyers were going through the findings and kind of got to the critical analysis part, they were asking specific questions, and she's like, yeah, it's really, to be honest, more of a high level impression. And it backed up a lot of what BDO was saying as well, that the KPMG report was very good. They said that multiple times. As much as Manshaus, Craig Wright's lawyer, was, pulling apart any inconsistencies or discrepancies that were found, because they were not on every single instance, but a lot of them they tried to reproduce the exact instances cited in the KPMG report. But with Cyfor, it felt more as if she was saying, yeah, there are inconsistencies sometimes. And as far as like the editing timetable, that's one thing that was cited a few different times, that how can a document have a longer editing period than it has age? And she said that's very normal. And it felt as though almost everything that was brought up was just, you can't rely on that. So almost, and I don't know if this was the strategy, but almost to discredit, if there was anything that the KPMG was, really driving home, and the BDO tore it down, that it was kind of another angle to almost dismiss that this is worthwhile, credible metadata, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It just sounds to me a lot more like Craig and his team are trying to introduce as much confusion rather than the clear timeline that Hodlonaut's team has been presenting. Were there any questions that stood out from the judge in today's sort of back and forth with witnesses?
Well, after there were 2 different witnesses from BDO, and BDO was hired by Craig Wright's team to go through the KPMG report submitted by Hodlonaut's team. And after, there was a lot of time spent on hashing, and there were very, very specific highlights of fonts and different things that had been brought up as almost smoking guns within the KPMG report with expert witness testimony. But the judge kind of summed up, well, Manshaus spent a lot of time talking about hash, talking about the page size, talking about fonts. Is any of this, what does this mean kind of at the end of the day? And it was almost in the way that they had definitely affirmed that the KPMG report was very good. It was saying, yeah, there are some discrepancies that we couldn't reproduce when doing our own tests to verify all the findings, but it doesn't actually impact overall. The document still was altered. And even though maybe in a different way, and the biggest thing that they cited as an explanation is the environment. And there's a lot of talking about, switching between Windows and Linux, and you can move a document back and forth if you're opening it on different processors and the dates of those different processors. That's when some of the metadata will change and there will be some unexplainable changes. So they went back a lot to, you have to have the exact environment to reproduce. And so since that, isn't known truly about Craig's situation, the KPMG team was probably in some ways coming up with what they thought was the best approximate match, and then also for BDO as well to match what they thought KPMG was doing to match Craig Wright. So it's a lot of triangulation more than anything.
Dustin, you're muted.
Reasons why.
You're good now.
Oh,
go ahead.
There we go. Okay. I would like to add to that and say this is one of the reasons why I think that the binary executable specifically was incredibly strong, because none of that happens to binaries. You don't open them in any other applications. They run as bytecode directly on your operating system. Copying them around doesn't change anything in them. I think someone suggested perhaps an antivirus scan could potentially modify a binary executable. The whole point of an antivirus is to detect modified executables when a virus modifies something to attach itself to an executable so that it gets run again later. That's what antivirus is looking for. It's not something that antivirus causes. So when you take all of that away in the example of a binary executable, they don't change. They don't change like that. You have to recompile them from source to change anything in them, like a version string. Even if a virus scanner was going to change something in an executable, it wouldn't be a very specific version number to look like an earlier version. None of that just makes zero sense. So that's why I felt like the binary executable modification was probably their strongest piece of evidence, because it's not subject to any of this other uncertainty that you have with PDF documents and Word documents and things like that.
I wonder if at a certain point, is there a possibility that the judge would turn around and ask, before making a determination, for Craig to possibly complete some sort of a transaction or actually, do the thing that he's not willing to do? Is that a possibility? Is that on the table here, do we think?
I don't. Based on at the end of day 2, when he was giving his witness testimony, the judge was saying, hey, look, you could probably make this all go away if you just did this. And why wouldn't you? And that was when he made his first very clear, he's trying to get 100 witnesses. He says he has about 70 now, but it's much more about the people that he has worked with that believe that he is Satoshi. And that's where I think it's important for people like Dustin to come forward, names that he's kind of looped in and said, this person saw an early draft of the white paper. This person can vouch for me. This person. If he's trying to build this argument on these character witnesses, it's very important for these character witnesses to be a part of this plan as well. But truly, I don't think that is actually an option. I mean, it would take a major change of heart for Craig, I think. I think the judge might be open to it, but I don't see that as a realistic possibility.
Yeah, and for once, he name dropped someone who isn't dead.
Well, it's not just the inconsistencies with his statements about Dustin. I mean, he claimed to control certain keys, certain Bitcoin addresses that have since been the owners of those addresses have since cryptographically signed messages saying that they're not CSW, they control the addresses. Look, at the end of the day, what it comes down to me is we should all be respectful of Satoshi's privacy. If Satoshi wants to remain private and doesn't want to come out publicly, so be it. That's his prerogative. But if someone's going to come around and be very, very public about claiming to be Satoshi, there is a bare minimum expectation there, and that should be signed messages. And we have just not seen that.
And I think that's more than justifiable to have a little bit of proof. I mean, the saying goes, don't trust, verify, after all. So we're simply asking for verification in the same way that Satoshi told us a long time ago to never trust and verify.
Hodlonaut's lawyer, Halkus, actually in some of his bigger, more eloquent closing statements referenced the mantra, don't trust, verify, as, this is, as we read in this white paper, if this is, if Craig Wright wrote this white paper, we're only following suit of what it says in the white paper, which it felt like a very nice, closing the loop.
Love that. And we did get a chance in the recap video to see some of the statements from Hodlonaut's lawyers for their closing remarks. Very passionate plea for the judge to adhere to the principles of free speech that Norway and the greater European Union had passed through. Anything in particular from the closing remarks, Mills, that you'd like to highlight for the team?
I mean, I'll read a few of the transcriptions. They were very inspirational. And I will say, not that I was maybe I was lightly skeptical. Day 1, the opening remarks were a little engaging from Hodlonaut's lawyer. And today, and I'm still getting all of this, translated from Norwegian, but a lot of what he said was very eloquent. So these are transcriptions of the translations, and I wrote a few of them down, and they definitely inspired hope in me. He talked a lot about the search for truth. You need to have the possibility to criticize people in power. It protects the individual's right to search for the truth. Sentencing someone of defamation is a limitation of freedom of speech, which in Norway, which in Norway, they do still have a freedom of speech protected in their Norwegian constitution. The principal difference between public and private spheres. Expression regarding public sphere is something good, where people should be able to express their minds without being afraid of prosecution. False statements that are defamatory can still be lawful. We want a process that leads to finding the truth. And he also said, what is the defamatory element in the tweets? Which statements damage the reputation of Craig Wright? It was very, this one really kind of just drove it home. If you make a statement that the world will contempt, that is defamatory. But if it's defamatory, it doesn't mean it's not true. And a defamatory statement that is true is lawful, and a true statement is always protected. It really inspired hope in me to think that there was an openness for the judge to remember that. I mean, because that's at the end of the day. This court case is about 9 tweets that happened over 4 days in 2019, 3.5 years ago. So these tweets, she is deciding whether they basically did serious harm. It's not the clause within Norwegian law as it is in UK, but to make that ruling, she really does have to decide. And one of the questions that she asked a couple days ago, which I think is probably one of the most important questions that she's going to be wrestling with in making this ruling, is whether Craig Wright is Satoshi affects his business Enchain and affects the value of BSV. And that will be, I think, a large factor and component in her decision-making process, because whether or not he is Satoshi in some ways is a different category, but his current business and also with BSV, the current, fork, and as she called it, the current currency that he is a part of, if his character and the ruling will affect and impact directly those business ventures, then that would actually kind of be defamation, maybe on her part too, as the ruling, the way I understand her question and the way this ruling will go.
I also loved the remarks that we saw where he essentially said, like, we need to be able to be critical of our leaders. Otherwise, like, that's a very dangerous precedent we are setting there. I don't know, Dustin, Odell, if you had any thoughts from what we were able to see in the recap video, or any of these statements made by Hodlonaut's team in particular.
Most of that part was in Norwegian, which I don't speak, so I was relying on translations through Twitter. So I don't have a lot there as far as what I understood. But yeah, from what I could tell, as Mills said, it seemed very inspiring, and I thought they did a really good job just going through and listing all of the evidence and all of the problems with all of the evidence, and it was very convincing to me.
Yeah, I mean, I would just reiterate that it's great that this is all being covered and out in the open rather than happening behind closed doors.
And shameless chill, if anyone speaks Norwegian and loves translating, still looking for a translator so we ended up releasing the Hodlonaut full testimony, but we have not been able to translate it and put subtitles on it. So if anyone is watching this that wants to be a part of that project, I would love for that. And then that's something that we can add into the YouTube video that we've already posted. but it's kind of unfair. Craig Wright's testimony was all in English, so we all have immediate access to it as English speakers, but less people speak Norwegian. So definitely still searching for translation support, and it's not a suppression of justice. I'm thankful we actually got the ruling from the court today that we can also release the autist expert witness as well, which in our original agreement with the press pool, that was an exemption that we weren't allowed to film. But when he went on the stand, the Manshouse, the lawyer for Craig Wright, said that streaming was permitted. So the stream stayed live. And so we kept filming. And then I put in a request to the court asking, does that mean we should still include this footage in the press pool? And they got back to me this morning saying that yes, it's all fine. So that's another witness that we will be able to upload. So we've been filming this entire trial. The only exception, and the judge has done a good workaround, that the witnesses just write down their date of birth and their private information, their address, and give her a piece of paper. And so our whole audio, while our main hurdle being that it's mostly in Norwegian, any of the English speaking witness testimonies we can also release. And the hope really being to let as much of this footage be out there, because there's nothing we're trying to hide. There is nothing to hide.
I'm curious because Odell, you mentioned this a couple of times now. Like, our coverage of this is bringing to light this trial, but this is not the first court case that Craig Wright has had. This is now the third one that has reached trial, and there are many more, or at least I believe it's the third one that's reached trial. And there are many more planned. Mills, you and I have had this conversation numerous times, but I'm curious, Dustin or Odell, if you feel like if a decision is made on Hodlonaut's side in this case, could that strengthen any argument against any of Craig Wright's future claims, or is it going to continuously be on to the next fight and let's make sure we win this next fight?
I believe it would be a great help to future cases. In fact, the reason that this case is happening in Norway was to try to preempt the other Hodlonaut versus Craig Wright case in the UK, and try to get a favorable ruling there so that it can be used in the UK case. So I would only imagine that it would also be beneficial to other future cases as well, especially with the exhaustive listing of all of the fraudulent evidence, not just that was submitted into evidence with this case, but from prior blog posts and prior signing sessions and everything else that was included.
I mean, a perfect example is Dustin himself, right? If we didn't have the coverage in the courtroom of the case happening, then Dustin wouldn't know that there was a conflict that was said under oath on stage in the courtroom. So having this stuff out in the open is a natural benefit for the truth. And unfortunately, Craig's team has been able to keep most of this stuff behind closed doors as much as possible and target individuals and companies privately. So to have more of this out in the open is just a massive net benefit for anyone who cares about the truth.
Yeah, something kind of tangentially related. This is a little bit of a skip, but someone asked me a few days ago, why Hodlonaut? Like, why, he didn't have this massive following. Yes, he was organizing a week of Craig Wright as a fraud week and doing these tweets, but didn't have a massive following, and a lot of what Manshouse was driving home was that, but he had access to the Jack Dorsey, realm of Twitter. So that's millions of people as far as a reach and impressions. But actually, I think this maybe is just a theory at this point, but Hodlonaut had about 4,000 followers before the Lightning Torch trust chain. And that involved a lot of very notable Bitcoiners. And then his following grew to about 8,000. So the time of these 9 tweets that are on trial his following number was about 8,000 on Twitter. But in many ways, when people have been like, well, why did Craig Wright target Hodlonaut? Like, what's the connection? Realizing, the specific request in the initial letter that was sent to Hodlonaut before any of the proceedings and any of the filings were initiated was to delete the tweets and then also to assert that Craig Wright is Satoshi. And Hodlonaut did delete the tweets after consulting a lawyer in the UK, said, yeah, delete the tweets. Hopefully this whole thing will go away. But it didn't. And that was brought up on stand. He did delete the tweets, but there was a few different discussions that Craig Wright went on the record saying an amicable resolution could have been achieved. But there was, I think it makes a lot of sense that wanting Hodlonaut to be a part of the community that he was and to go on the record saying that Craig Wright is Satoshi was actually maybe the motive behind the why he was not targeted, but why this all kind of came on to him, even though he wasn't a super notable, high profile, Bitcoiner on Twitter.
I think, a common tactic of bullies is to make examples of people, public examples of people, and then to hope that everyone else falls in line. And Craig and the few people that stand behind him and support him have basically executed on that strategy. And it was to me, from my perspective, it was, a multi-pronged strategy. You target devs, you target exchange holders, exchange owners, you target, rich people, public people in the space. But then also you target someone who is more of the grassroots community. And specifically to me, it was never about the court case. It was about unveiling the privacy that Hodlonaut chose to take for him and his family, which was not to go by his legal name. And you have seen that from the very beginning, that regardless of this case and regardless of the progress of this case, Craig and his allies have made a point of trying to expose his legal identity and uproot his life as much as possible. And I think it was meant to be a signal to other people who care about privacy in the space that if you fuck with me, I will make your life miserable. And it never had anything to do with, the actual court case itself.
It's unfortunate, but Odell, I do think you are onto something there, because this is less about attacking the credibility of what Hodlonaut did, but much more rooted around just attacking him as a person and defending Craig as a person. Almost like there's a degree of almost social credit score going on here, in my opinion, just of what I've been able to gather from Craig Wright's lawyers teams and the way they are approaching this case. Dustin, I'm going to put you on the spot, and an acceptable answer is fuck off, Q. But given sort of the response from the lawyers and the court today, in a future case, would you be willing to be a witness for any of the people that Craig Wright is suing?
Yeah, if Craig is lying about me on the stand, I'm happy to refute it all day long, any day. If I can be useful as a character witness or anything else, I'm happy to discuss that with the various legal teams, and we'll see if it's useful. But if it's a lie about me directly, I'm all in every single time.
Q, can I ask a question, just because we have Dustin here, and you were here with me on Friday, day 5, when I was trying to explain, it was the KPMG source code metadata analysis, and I did as much research as possible to be able to explain. Thank you for laughing. I really did try. I would love as much as you want to share, but another alternative explanation to why the Sartre blog post and the source code metadata that's in the KPMG report. I'm not sure how much of that you were able to follow along from the case, but anything as far as like the technical, why it's a smoking gun, why it's a glove, an OJ glove, like I would love to hear from someone else other than me trying to explain it from newly learned information.
Sure. I can explain that. So you more or less had it correct in your explanation the other day. I watched the video and was able to follow what you were saying. Essentially, what it appears happened is Craig took a more recent version of the source code that had a bug fix in it. It had been patched to fix a bug and backdated it to when the bug still should have existed, and the bug had been fixed in the supposedly earlier version of the code that Craig submitted. So that pretty much tells us that it was an older version that was modified to look like a much earlier version because that bug fix was present. With the starter signature, the interesting thing about this is when that blog post was made, two of my colleagues in the information security community, Dan Kaminsky and Robert Graham, both took a look at that and took two different analysis methods to arrive at the same conclusion, which was the signature was lifted from a transaction in the blockchain that Satoshi had made. So it was a valid Satoshi signature. But the hash that went into that signature from the transaction was reused as the supposed hash of the starter file. And the starter file was not provided in its entirety. It only showed, the screenshots only showed like the first 14% or so of the file. And so it was impossible to verify what the hash of the file actually was. And you had to take Craig's word for it that the hash was this other one, which was actually lifted from the blockchain. So when you went to verify the signature, it of course checked out because it's a valid signature from that hash, just not the file that was being claimed to have been signed.
Thank you. So much confidence in that explanation. I really appreciate it.
Mills, you got it right.
Yeah, and to technical people that know these technologies and understand this stuff, these forgeries are all incredibly obvious. They're fairly amateur, to be perfectly honest.
That's long been the suspicion in the conversation that we've been having here as well, that feels like all we need is one Bitcoiner on a jury to help make sure that this case gets handled properly. But of course, Craig will go out of his way to make sure that never happens.
There's something to be said too. This is just the judge. This is just Helen's decision. We don't have a jury. And I think that that's actually incredibly advantageous in many ways, because I think specifically the amount of emotional, relational, human reference person stories can really sway a jury. And I think the judge really has her eye on the prize of staying impartial, focusing on exactly what's being presented, who has a stronger argument. And there was actually a pretty clear delineation today about that this is not a criminal trial. Therefore, it does not have to be, with beyond the shadow of a doubt. It has to be the more likely. And the way that it was she said it in English, and so it was like the more likelihood or higher likelihood. And that is, that means she has to decide, is it more likely that this is the whole case? Is it more likely that Craig Wright is Satoshi, or is it more likely that Craig Wright is not Satoshi? And that is the decision that she's going to have to make.
That you alluded to earlier, and I'd love to just touch on while we have you here. This is not where the buck stops. Craig Wright has made a habit out of suing people, both people who just are talking about him, about the case, about what he says, as well as developers who are actually building on Bitcoin to a point where some have even been scared away. Do you have a message or something to say to anyone who may be watching some of these things transpire and have concerns about speaking up themselves?
Look, I mean, concerns are warranted. That is literally the strategy that Craig and his allies have worked on, which is to bully people into not speaking. And I think it's important here to thank Dustin for stepping up, and thank others for stepping up, and thank all the people who we don't actually even know their identity, who came up and signed messages with keys that Craig pretended he controlled. We do need people to step up here. Otherwise, this will continue. Fortunately, people are, but still to this day, I mean, you even see, large exchange owners, you see people that have a lot at stake in this space, and in this space being unencumbered by bullshit, that are still scared to speak up. And, that's the unfortunate reality. Ultimately, it's up to every individual to make a personal decision. But me personally, I just, I don't respond well to bullies. And it's important that people do talk about it.
And I don't respond well to liars.
Honestly, I don't respond well to either. So the three of us just make a terrible trio for bullies and liars to deal with. But Mills, it has now gotten dark in Oslo. That's how long we've been talking to you today. I want to first give you the final word, and then we'll go to Odell, and then Dustin will give you the last word here. But I want to thank you all for joining us today. I want to remind everyone who is watching, the final day of coverage is not tomorrow. It will be Wednesday, where Mills will be back reporting off of the final day of coverage. That will be Craig Wright's team's closing remarks there. You can join us 1 p.m. Eastern time. Press the subscribe button down below. Mills, I turn the mic over to you.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It seems a little unfortunate that we have to have this day in between, and Hodlonaut's lawyers are halfway through their closing remarks, but at least they get to kick off the final day. And for anyone wondering, the reason for that is because Craig switched lawyers very recently. This trial had already been scheduled, and it was originally supposed to be 8 days. And I mean, it was 10, and then it was shortened to 8. But then once he switched to this new legal team, one of his lawyers has a court case at the Supreme Court in Oslo tomorrow, and so he's unavailable tomorrow. So they decided to just take a day off for Tuesday, and then we'll resume on Wednesday. So that's kind of why this weird break is happening. But we'll start Wednesday with Hodlonaut's lawyer wrapping up their closing arguments, and then the remainder of the day will be Craig Wright's lawyers' closing statements. And I think one thing that, and I did an interview this afternoon with another gentleman that has been a part of the Florida case, and it's been interesting because there's actually a lot of people that are attending this case that, for different reasons, have been at different court cases in the past, whether they're writing books, whether they're reporters from different publications. But it's very fascinating that almost everyone that was a part as a witness that was called to this case in Oslo, that was also called as a witness in Florida, is citing how different the court system, the judicial system, the legal system is run here. And in my interview, he said, think of Florida as a 10. I mean, there were people yelling at each other. Oslo's about at a 1. Like the Norwegian, it's very stoic, it's very serious. And even some of the zingers and the lines that are really powerful and are kind of gotcha moments, they're not said with a lot of emotion or passion or tone, which I mean, I am keeping a straight face in the court, but also there are some times when it's like, I heard that, I know that was really funny, I can't laugh, but inside, wow. So it's been interesting to see, I think, because Craig is a lot more used to that passionate way of being in court. I think it's been interesting to see kind of a more tame version, but obviously his lawyers are Norwegian, the ones that are doing the majority of the speaking, Helly and Manshaus. And I'm very curious to see how much emotion gets brought into their closing on Wednesday, because even in their opening remarks on Tuesday last week, there was a lot more personality than Hodlonaut's lawyers exhibited. There's a little bit more smiling, a little bit more emotion. So I'm curious to see, but also this has been a very wild ride, and it's funny. Even though we had the weekend off, it feels very funny that being back in court today felt a lot more normal than even having time off, just being in Oslo, because we've spent a lot of time in the exact same room with the exact same people, and it's become very familiar. So.
Thank you, Mills. Odell, I turn it over to you.
I'll leave you with 3 final thoughts. The first one is I've seen a lot of speculation out there that Hodlonaut is doing this for personal gain. As being someone involved in the OpenSats legal fund, I think it's important for people to know that Hodlonaut is not receiving any money from that fund directly. A portion of it will be going to pay his legal fees, but he does not get a lump sum of it that he just gets to walk away with. The fact of the matter is it's the exact opposite. Him and his family have, massive financial, mental burdens that are happening because of this case, and it's the farthest thing from a net gain possible. My second thought is I want to thank the team over at Bitcoin Magazine for their great coverage of this event, and everyone, including Dustin, who has stepped up and publicly put their neck on the line in the search for truth. And then last but not least, the truth will prevail here.
Well said, Odell. Thank you. Dustin.
I don't have too much else to say. I'm just happy for the opportunity to be here and to speak with you all. If there's anything technical in the future that you would like to have explained, I'm happy to do that. I'm fairly good at conveying technical subjects in a more simplified manner. So happy to do that anytime.
Oh, you're going to regret that, because Dustin and I will be sliding in your DMs very soon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. That is a wrap on today's special report out of the Hodlonaut v. Craig Wright trial out of Oslo. As we have mentioned, we will pick up for the final day of coverage of this on Wednesday. I want to remind everyone to please, if you are not already, subscribe down below to the channel. We are going to be back this afternoon, not here on YouTube, but over on Twitter. We're going to be joined by Dylan LeClaire, Sam Rule, and Dr. Jeff Ross to talk all things Bitcoin price, because apparently Bitcoin is hovering back below 20K, made a nice little touchdown to 18K. Couldn't talk about price while Odell was on the screen. He would have killed me. So if you want to talk price, hop on over to Twitter. We're going to be going live at about 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern time. Until then, stack sats and stay humble, fam.